Hello and welcome to Spacewalk's Money Talks, a podcast where we talk about outer space business, technology, and policy. I'm Chris Alvarez, and today's guest is Manfred von Ehrenfried, also known as Dutch, and we talk about the Artemis Lunar program. Thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Manfred von Ehrenfried, also known as Dutch, author of the Artemis Lunar program, published by Springer and available May 2020, this month. Thank you for speaking with me.
You bet.
So first, tell me about your background in space.
Well, I'm one of the original Space Task Group guys out of Langley. I started in 1961 as a flight controller trainee under Gene Kranz and Chris Kraft and John Hodge and those guys. Mm-hmm. Spent the rest of the Mercury program at Langley, and then everybody moved to Texas, of course. Mm-hmm. And so after the Mercury program, after the last flight, we all moved to Houston.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Have you stayed in space since then, or I guess you must have if you've written this book? But
well, actually, I spent Mercury, Gemini, and early Apollo at Houston. Mm-hmm. Worked in the space station program office as a contractor in Washington for a while. Mm-hmm. Also went off into the nuclear world for about 7 years. Mm-hmm. Wrote a book on that as well. And then, so I haven't been actively involved as a contractor or as an employee since about 94-ish. Mm-hmm. Then I've been in the finance world since then.
Oh, okay. I'm sure you
still writing on the side.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you have pretty fascinating stories from the days you spent back there on those programs.
Yes, indeed. I put a lot of those in the books along the way.
Okay. So let's talk about this particular book. I see it's divided into 4 main sections: overview, spacecraft, landers, rovers, and payloads, elements, and then NASA and commercial crew development. Tell me about what's your approach in the book? Is it more technical, a bit about business? How do you mix it up?
Well, it's really an overview in the sense of the program having started in 2017 and going to about 2030 or so. Mm-hmm. So it's really a status of where things stand now. I included all of the controversy about the beginnings and the gateways and so forth, but then later go into enabling technologies and some conclusions about how it relates to Mars or doesn't relate to Mars. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I wrote a book on Mars as well. But it's really a sort of like a reference book that people can use for the next many years. Mm-hmm. On what is going on and what the different elements and modules and so forth are. Mm-hmm. Added some conclusions and different things that sort of substantiate the positions I take. It goes into some explanations of some of the strange things about the program, like the halo orbits and the Hall effect thrusters and things like that, solar electrics, and some neat stuff that's going on technology-wise that should facilitate not only this program, but human Mars missions. It's quite a broad spectrum of research on those sides.
So as far as the controversy about whether we should skip the moon and go to Mars or start with the moon and then go on to Mars, have you always been on one side of the debate, or have you adjusted your thinking in any way on that controversy?
Well, a lot of the controversy is based first on the gateway, mm-hmm. and then the controversy is related to the approach to selling Artemis as the wherewithal for supporting Mars missions. So there's a lot of discussion in that in the book. First on the gateway, which is still a point of contention for many people. We actually got trapped into position we're in because we don't have a super heavy lift launch vehicle, and so after they canceled the Saturn, we just don't have the capability to throw massive weights into lunar orbits go directly. So the Gateway is sort of has been a result of not having that capability. We'll soon have it one of these days. But even the SLS Block 2 doesn't have that kind of capability. That's one aspect of controversy. The second controversy is to what degree does the Artemis program really support the Mars program? The question is, do we go Mars direct, or do we use this gateway concept? And I think Bridenstine sort of sold it that we have to have the Artemis in order to have that capability, but you don't need to have a gateway at all for Mars missions. I think what's happened is that it's almost like the old, it's all you got is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Well, what we have is the ISS, and so the Gateway looks like a mini ISS. And so we certainly know how to build those kind of modules and so forth, but there's absolutely nothing in the Gateway, even the advanced gateways, that will ever go to Mars. Even the Orion itself cannot go to Mars. Not the 21-day Orion that we have now. So even the Orion will not be able to go without being reconfigured, expanded, and so forth. The SLS, we really have many SLSs right now. We don't even have the great Block 2 super heavy lift vehicle. It'll be another 10 years before we have that. So there's many people that say go Mars direct and use your orbital ISS for the test and check out of the modules and elements and so forth. So we'll eventually have better launch vehicles than the SLS in the near future, but even that will be another many, many years. So there's that controversy as well. I think what Bridenstine has done is he sold the Artemis program using Mars as the test bed to help sell the program. But we're going to have the Artemis as we see it now for at least a decade or so. We just have a long way to go to get to a Mars capability.
So what do you see as the benefits of the Artemis program?
The scientists, the lunar scientists, are all up for it. Most everybody in the world is up for it from the standpoint of science. But the big problem and the biggest advantage, I think, of Artemis is that you have to be able to process the regolith to get water and ice and water to process into oxygen and fuels, and that whole capability of ISU, whatever they call it, in situ utilization, is the only way we're ever going to get to Mars, because NASA still keeps pushing this conjunction class Mars mission, which requires you to leave the crew on the surface for a year and a half, which means you can't possibly resupply that much resources without having the capability to process the regolith. So that, to me, is one of the biggest advantages of going back to the moon is learning how to do all that. And it's not as easy as people think. Well, you just you get the ice, you just process it, and you just get your oxygen, you get your hydrogen, and you make your fuel, and blah blah blah. It sounds like it's real easy, but it's not.
Okay.
So that the scientists, on the other hand, the payloads, the lunar surface payloads, is another big advantage. Although we know how to make spectrometers and magnetometers and all these other sensors, they're all directly applicable to Mars missions, just as the robotics missions are today. So the scientists will be quite happy with getting to the moon.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about going to the South Pole because they think that the water ice is mostly there. But we can't go to the backside of the moon like the Chinese have already done.
Mm-hmm.
But we still need, line of sight capabilities to somewhere, like the gateway to Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So the place that they're going now, if you look at the moon, if you look at the full moon and look at the bottom of it,
Mm-hmm.
that some of that part is in constant daylight or close to the water sources. So that's why they're going there. But a lot of the water ice is on the backside in that Aitken Basin. But certainly the places that they're planning to go that are in direct line of sight will be a likely place to start.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this whole thing about sustainability is another problem. And you can't really have sustained lunar base operations without the ability to, keep going there. So right now they're talking about a year or two between Artemis flights. So you won't really have sustainability until they're able to process that regolith to, get some of the resources that they need to, without having to preposition them there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be 5-10 years, maybe even longer, before we have, quote, sustainability.
I'm speaking with Manfred von Ehrenfried, author of The Artemis Lunar Program. You can find more information at dutch-von-ehrenfried.com. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate it on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. These ratings go a long way in increasing the popularity of my podcast, and I'm grateful for any support you can give me. Please sign up for my newsletter at spacewalksmoneytalks.com. Please post your comments and questions about this podcast or the episode on Facebook at Spacewalks Money Talks or on YouTube at Spacewalks Money Talks. You can contact me directly on Twitter at SpacewalksMT and on Instagram at Spacewalks Money Talks. If you like military history, please listen to my podcast, Military History Inside Out, located at warscholar.org and militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you like science fiction, fantasy, and horror, please listen to my podcast, Full Contact Nerd, also located at chrisalvarez.com and fullcontactnerd.com. Now back to the podcast. Why does the United States have such a problem overcoming the line of sight obstacle as far as getting to the far side of the moon, with China having done it, but the U.S., is it just because of the communications satellite, or?
Well, the Chinese have got, you go back to these Lagrange points where the gateway is at Lagrange 1, and the Chinese have their satellite is at L2, and so they can have their little rovers transmitting directly back to L2, and then they're having to go from there. But we would need to have either the Chinese play a role, which they're not playing any role right now in our programs, to use their L2 satellite. We could put one there as well. But right now they're all planning on this halo orbit, which is an L1.
Okay.
So you got to have a relay satellite to get the data back to Earth.
Mm-hmm. And is it that much more expensive or difficult to put that there than all the, we put tons of satellites up in space.
Yeah, we're good at that for low Earth orbit for sure, or even high orbits, for sun synchronous or geosynchronous.
Mm-hmm.
But the L1 orbits, these are very strange orbits, so I put an appendix to try to explain these things.
Mm-hmm.
They're very large, they're in like 6,000-7,000 mile orbits that move. They're sort of quasi-stable. You have to kind of keep it resupplied, reboosted a little bit, not as much as otherwise, but so that's a problem in itself. It takes many days. I think it's 7 days or something like that to get back to the moon and back. Apollo was 3 days to Earth and back. But from these rectilinear halo orbits, it's longer. So that's an operational problem for sure.
Okay. So focusing on the Artemis program, you've already mentioned some challenges and such. But what other challenges, either in business rules, technology, or space policy, are you most concerned about, and why, in regards to the Artemis program?
Well, back to the mixture of budgetary things versus sequencing of things. Right now, with the delays and everything, delays in the SLS and cost overruns and all that stuff, it sort of gets mixed up into not just pure which way do we go versus how much money do we have and when can we go, that kind of thing. Certainly the technologies are extremely advanced now. There's all kinds of really neat, super technology things that are even here now or will soon be here now. Some of my favorites are these new power systems. The kilopower system is a new uranium-powered system, which is many times larger than the plutonium systems we have now on Mars, like Curiosity, which is not much more than a 100-watt light bulb. But the kilowatt power system is operational, and it's been tested, and it's ready to go. The batteries are all changing. We change batteries now on ISS, but even the batteries that are beyond what we just replaced will be far more superior. A lot of new things going on in lithium batteries, not the ones we have now. There's a lot of new things going on in radiation protection on these, like these new nitride nanotubes that can be woven into fabrics that can trap out radiation more effectively, and that's going to revolutionize things if that works. There's new communications technology, and here again, all this is related to policy. New things that are related to the laser communications back to Earth. There's all kinds of new things on the regenerative fuel cells, and even the solar power systems are changing drastically, much more efficient, much more lighter, and these new small satellites like these CubeSats, of which there's something like 16 of those, even on Artemis 1, that are advancing all kinds of neat things. One of the things from an old guidance officer standpoint is that this inertial guidance and also this guidance and navigation systems that are autonomous and are able to avoid hazards automatically, they're really getting to be something to behold. So policy will be inherently coupled with the technologies, and so they're pretty well set up now on the next decade or so. Not much is going to change policy-wise that is not related more so to the capabilities that they have and the problems that they have with SLS and Orion and all the others. I'm really excited about the technologies related to the regolith processing. That's going to be a game changer, I think, because of what I said before about you can't go to Mars without it. Some neat capabilities there.
Is PNT an issue when operating on the moon? Is there any problems there?
Well, there are certainly advances there. I think I covered a little bit of that, but maybe not as much as I should have. But the new atomic clocks are related to that. The navigation precision landing systems they're trying to be totally autonomous. You think of Neil Armstrong trying to pilot the lunar module back with these eyeballs. Well, they're going to have not only eyeballs, but there are all kinds of sensors that are looking out, that are trying to process the speeds and the cross-range tracking and all that kind of stuff. And so all of that, I think, will be in the new landers, which are not even built yet, but certainly got some 2 or 3 designs going. So that's going to be easier than Apollo from that standpoint. But you couple all that together with the deep space laser communications and atomic clocks and all kinds of other stuff, that I think that part of the game from a technology standpoint will be easier than the things that relate to sustainability, like the regolith processing and life support systems. Even the life support systems on the backpacks, they're all changed. The suits have all changed. So the technology is really moving out in many areas.
Do you think that the government contracts for these different aspects of the mission can keep up with the technological changes? Will they be able to adapt quickly enough if something new comes across over this,
But NASA has really sponsored all this technology development, and the industry is, as well as the NASA laboratories, are cooperating on almost every technology area. So the fact that NASA's being a little, with their 0.5% budget, is trying to, sort of reinforce the systems with the industry. The industry is jumping on board to help with all that. They couldn't do it without this cooperative venture, for sure.
Do you see any challenges right now that could be easily fixed or addressed that no one's really taken care of yet?
I don't see anything that hasn't been addressed. Whether or not which technology advances the fastest and is able to be made operational. I think certainly the radiation thing is one of the biggest concerns for deep space travel, and so any of those technologies would be crucial. I think the power systems are being addressed very well with not only the kilowatt nuclear systems, but all the batteries and solar powers and stuff. I think that area is pretty well advanced. I think the navigation thing is pretty well taken care of. The life support systems, certainly they have huge efforts in that regard. They've solved, I think, the suit problem. I think they've even addressed the sharpness of the lunar regolith problem in static electricity and that kind of thing. There's just so many different advances that I can't think of one that hasn't been addressed. But certainly, the life support thing is the crucial one. But you got to have all these other things in order to do the former. A lot of it relates to the Mars thing, only because of NASA's. Here's a good policy one for you. NASA's policy for pushing the conjunction class long stay mission is one I would certainly disagree with, and I've been pushing the other 6 or so ways to go to Mars without having to do that. So that's a big policy one, but not an Artemis policy one.
Okay. Have you written about that in other books that people could look up?
Yeah, I wrote one book on a mission to Phobos and Deimos first, as the easiest way to really do a Mars mission. I started one that I proposed to Springer this year, or earlier this year, but they thought there's just too many Mars books out there right now, and it's so far out in advance that maybe next year. But I proposed several different ways to go to Mars first, the precursor missions, I call them, that don't risk the crews, require them to stay on the surface for a year and a half before they can get a ride home. I think that's a bad policy.
Yeah. How do you see the interplay with the big commercial ventures, the interplay with the Artemis program? Is there, I don't know what it is specifically, so.
Well, there are some that are pretty far out kinds of things, like, mining, for example, that try to be commercial, but it's just too far out. There's another commercial view on one of my favorite ideas is Mars caves and lunar caves to protect against radiation, and there's a couple commercial businesses that are involved with that. I covered that slightly in my Martian book, which was called From Caveman to Cave Martian. That's another one. The commercialization aspects that really can make money, I think, are pretty far out. I think they're a decade out or maybe two. I just don't see that happening in the near, within a generation, say.
And how about the involvement of Boeing, SpaceX, and Blue Origin in Artemis? Is there?
Yeah. Well, NASA can't do without them. They're just they're so essential. NASA desperately needs all of them. On the commercial spacecraft, hopefully we'll see a launch this month from SpaceX, Crew Dragon. The payloads, they're all essential. The science community is depending on them. I think what NASA's doing there, from a contracting standpoint, is great. I mean, they've got to do that. There are some companies that seem to be, just small pieces of the program, but that's all right. And then there's the main ones that you mentioned that are having the big launch vehicle and big payload systems. But there are many others. There's probably 50 to 100 other companies involved in Artemis.
Yeah.
Yeah, and each of them, some of these contracts are quite small. Just a few millions here and there. But a good example of, I met Red Whitaker from Carnegie. He's building one of the landers. Guys like that are, they're just geniuses. I mean, the advancements in robotics, it's just unreal. They're just something to see. And when I think of a crew on the surface looking for, let's say, an overhang or a cave or a lava tube or whatever, you've got to have the robots to send in there to explore things first to be sure they're safe. You've got to have robots to go look for wherever the payload landed that you can't see, it landed long or short. The amount of cooperative human robotic capabilities is just hard to believe. I mean, we're just not going to be able to go anywhere without cooperative robotics.
Are there any leaders right now in robotics, any companies?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The group that I just mentioned from Carnegie Mellon, Astrobotics, is certainly a leader. The groups that are making other payloads, they're certainly quite advanced in some areas. I mentioned the boron nitrate nanotubes. There's a brand new company down at Hampton next to Langley that's just been working in that field for a couple of years. That's all new. There's just, but of course, the Europeans are doing the same thing. They've got their own groups trying to make advances in these systems. I get a kick out of the Kennedy group that got what they call the Swamp Works. These are robots that process regolith. That's neat to see. Yeah, there's these companies are just they come out of the woodwork almost to support other bigger companies. They're all little subs to somebody else like Lockheed or Northrop Grumman, but they're essential.
Yeah, the science fiction side of me, when you mention a robot that processes regolith, I just imagined a robot, a man-eating robot, like it, it can't tell the difference between the regolith and the people handling it.
Well, the one that they got down, you have to check out Swamp Works. It's just a giant machine that just gobbles up the regolith and dumps it into big processors, which gets you into this thing called 3D printing, which is another thing that people think is real simple, but it's not. It's simple on Earth, and we've got all kinds of neat things going on with that, everything to build rocket nozzles, to whatever. But when you get to the moon, you got to process regolith for other reasons. Some concepts sort of show you building your own little cave out of it, like a big dome. But the 3D printing thing is not as simple as it happens here on Earth, because you've got so many other energy-related things like this burning things together to form a solid kind of a thing. This sintering is called, thermal sintering. That's not so easy to do without a lot of power. And so you can get your power on Earth, but you got to deal with the 4 or 5 different power systems that you have on the moon. And then it takes some of this other material that merges the materials together that makes it a solid. That's well, you got to bring that from Earth, probably. So it's not going to be quite so easy. Get a chapter on that.
I'm speaking with Manfred von Ehrenfried, author of the Artemis Lunar Program. You can find more information at dutch-von-ehrenfried.com. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate it on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. These ratings go a long way in increasing the popularity of my podcast, and I'm grateful for any support you can give me. Please sign up for my newsletter at spacewalksmoneytalks.com. Please post your comments and questions about this podcast or the episode on Facebook at Spacewalks Money Talks or on YouTube at Spacewalks Money Talks. You can contact me directly on Twitter at SpacewalksMT and on Instagram at Spacewalks Money Talks. If you like military history, please listen to my podcast, Military History Inside Out, located at warscholar.org and militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you like science fiction, fantasy, and horror, please listen to my podcast, Full Contact Nerd, also located at chrisalvarez.com and fullcontactnerd.com. Now back to the podcast. One of the issues I always wonder about when you mix government and private companies, and obviously an issue that's existed for a while, are there any differences in standards as far as quality assurance or safety standards between the two?
Well, there's probably a lot of difference because NASA can, over QA things. So when I was a pressure test subject, before I would get into a chamber, I must have had 20 different people monitoring how I was getting ready and suited up and so forth. Everything from doctors to QA guys from one company, a QA guy from another company, and blah, 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 and monitors outside the chambers and so forth. Well, industry can do that too, but you don't have to have, 3 or 4 QA guys, everybody signing the books and so forth. So I think they probably have certainly streamlined QA, and I think it's almost like deregulation today in other areas. After a while, you kind of think, well, I think we've over-regulated this or over-QA'd that.
Yeah. So as far as the Artemis program or even any other space program, are there any issues in space exploration that people aren't talking about that you think they should be discussing? Let's say you were you're a NASA administrator for a day, head of NASA for a day, what would you want to focus on that they're not?
Well, one of the conflicts that will always be there that maybe people don't hear too much about is this bit about protecting the Earth from the Moon and protecting the Moon from the Earth, and so that's been going on for 60 years. It's sort of in the background, but there are some people who just refuse to accept the fact that we're going to go to Mars and the Moon, and we're going to just put viruses everywhere, and or we're going to all die. That's why we quarantined the Apollo guys for a while until we realized that it was overkill. And so I think that issue will go on, and it's sort of like not talked about all that much. And another area that is always talked about, but it's kind of hard to balance, is the risk versus gain thing, where how much protection do we give the crew? Well, it turns out that we go overboard, and so we've killed some people because of we're approaching things in the right way, but that will always be a big concern, and there will always be people on both sides of that argument.
So obviously you're a person who's excited about space. You've worked with it for a while, but right now, at this point, what are you most excited about?
Well, my problem is that my horizon line doesn't match my lifeline. So I'm 84, so I can kind of say, well, yeah, I would have loved to have worked on Mars. I would have loved to even today have some work that's related to Mars, but I know I'll never see it. I'm not even sure if I'll see the human lunar landing. So and most of my contemporaries are in that same boat. All the moonwalkers are dying off, and even the flight controllers of the Apollo era are dying off. So we're still excited about space, but we don't get the chance to work on projects as much as we'd like to, even in these years.
Well, I know that the space program itself, it's developed, like medicine-wise, they developed technologies that I think has helped people now today, extend and improve their lives.
Definitely. People don't realize the spinoffs from NASA. I mean, there's something, I don't know, maybe 100,000 different spinoffs from the space program over the last, half century. People don't see it. I mean, they might think about cell phones and chips and stuff like that. There's so much more spinoff from NASA than the average person would ever know.
So stepping back in time a little bit, when you first started working on the space program, compared to what you see now, so two things. What are you surprised we're doing now? Back then, what would you have been surprised to hear about that's going on now? And two, what are you most disappointed about that you thought would happen by this time?
Well, in '69, I applied for the astronaut thing, but and I thought, the space station was right around the corner, and it turns out it wasn't. And so the time constants are slipping. I still see brilliance in young people, but I see stupidity in them as well, which I don't think I saw that when I was a kid. Maybe it's because of the internet and the TVs that you see and hear stupid people.
Yeah, they have a bigger voice.
Yeah. But there are still brilliant young people, and certainly guys like Musk and them have hired them, and they're working their little hearts out just like we did. I think what you see in management is that people are more risk averse now. Maybe we were not risk averse enough when, when I was there. We always thought that, space is dangerous as hell, that we're bound to kill somebody, which we eventually did. But even back in Mercury, we just amazed at, because I saw things blow up all the time when I was in my 20s. It just seemed like that was the natural process. But now just like this virus thing going on now, there are people that would shut down the whole world just to be sure that we didn't kill somebody the next day. We just get too risk adverse. It doesn't balance out with other risks. But the Russians have lost some, we've lost some, and they were all mostly things that maybe could have been caught along the way. In typical failure mode analysis, it takes about 7 different things to fail before you get a catastrophic one.
Yeah.
And maybe we could have seen that.
So is there something now that we're doing that you're surprised that we achieved at this point, or have we just been slow on everything over the past 50 years?
Well, the robotics world, the JPL world I think has moved along smartly. I mean, it's just amazing what they've done with robots, and the sophistication of the reentry and landing systems, as well as the sensors and the long-range control of the robots from millions of miles away. I think that's fascinating, and now we've been I started working on the headquarters as a contractor. I worked on the original Space Station Task Force, so that's 1962. Well, we didn't get there for almost 20 years later. It was before we had humans on the space station. I forgot what year that was. But so the time constants are extremely long. Look how long it's taken for us to build an SLS. Jeez. I mean, we built a Saturn V in 6 years or something like that, and we don't have the same capability even today. And they've been playing with the SLS. Well, it started off as Aries or something, and then converted. So I don't know why that takes so long.
Were you when you saw the I forget the name of it, but when the two first stage rockets returned, and landed in tandem?
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's fascinating. The amount of without a GPS system, they say they couldn't have done that. So it's a sort of like another system that supports this system. So and then plus the precision of the controls. I don't think we've had that kind of control, 3-dimensional control plus downrange control and all that. That's just fascinating. Yeah, I was amazed at that for sure.
Okay, so that one surprised you.
Oh yeah.
Did you expect them when you saw them trying it? Did you expect failure, or did you just hold your breath?
Well, like I say, I've seen enough things fail. So we used to go down on Cocoa Beach and with binoculars and just wait for an explosion, just to see it.
Wow. What was the most spectacular explosion you saw? Hopefully no human injury.
No human. I think it was an Atlas. I think it was a Ranger. It had to be like 62 or 3. So I actually had binoculars on it at liftoff, and it went up, 20, 30 seconds or so, and when it exploded, not only was it a gigantic fireball, but you could see the engines fall, the heavy parts fall, and the aluminum became shrapnel that was like falling leaves. And it would take maybe a half an hour before all of the pieces actually fell to earth, because the heat kept them rising a little bit, and then they would fall and they would rise some more. And it was just like like watching a tree shed its leaves.
Wow.
That was spectacular.
And that was Cocoa Beach area, you said?
Yeah, at Cape Canaveral.
Right.
Sometimes, depending on where, our Mercury Control Center was only a few miles from the launch pad, Pad 14. And when we weren't launching and somebody else was launching, we'd be, at our Cocoa Beach hotel beaches and watching.
I can imagine the Soviets had their fair amount of explosive incidents
Oh, yeah. They burned people alive on the pad.
Hmm.
There was one general that was so enamored by this. I think it was one of their big ones, like the N1 or whatever it was called.
Mm-hmm.
And when it blew, there were a lot of people sitting in chairs not too far away. I mean, like maybe a football field or two away.
Mm-hmm.
And they were, some of them were burned alive.
Wow. Is that massive?
Didn't come out for decades.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I'm sure.
In fact, I think you can see a video of that on YouTube somewhere.
Oh really? It finally came out.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you have any book about your time in those early programs? Have you written about that?
Well, the birth of NASA was the one that I did most of the work on the Space Task Group.
Mm-hmm.
That was covered from Sputnik on, and so that one covered just about everybody who worked on the Space Task Group for Mercury.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting about that was the Eisenhower groups that were responding to Sputnik and how that then got over to who was going to be in Project Mercury. There were things about that I had no idea that was happening, in the people that were involved. That was fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm.
Let alone the starting up Mercury,
mm-hmm.
Which was also fascinating for a young man. I was like 25,
mm-hmm.
but the things that you would see in early, let's say the first months after Sputnik, and how the scramble for that was kind of neat.
Mm.
And who were the players of that?
Mm-hmm. Is it? Have you seen any of the old hardware in the Air and Space Museums in the D.C. area? Have you gone and seen those?
I worked in D.C. for 25 years. In fact, I was across the street at the Capitol Gallery, across from the Air and Space Museum, and we used to go in there for lunch times and wander around.
Is it at all strange, or was it strange to see this stuff you worked on now in a museum?
Yeah, back. I was up at one of the Dallas museums last year,
mm-hmm.
Apollo 7 spacecraft there, and I worked on Apollo 7 for 2 years. And so I wound up giving a briefing of what was that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of neat. It's kind of neat for me to even look at even older stuff.
Yeah. The stuff that predated your work.
Well, yeah, there was stuff that I was a child when it happened.
Mm-hmm.
I go to. I don't know if you've ever been to Space Fest, but it was canceled this year. But that's a place you really enjoy.
What's that called again?
Space Fest, FEST.
Oh, okay.
It's where all the astronauts and flight controllers and come and give talks, and then thousands of people come for all the briefings and the storytelling and the movies and so forth.
And where's that held normally?
That's in Tucson.
Tucson, okay.
Yeah, go to spacefest.info.
Mm-hmm.
They've canceled this year. They were going to have it in July, but they decided to push it off.
Yeah. Can you ever imagine, the size of the space budget as it was for the Apollo program? Can you ever imagine that percentage of the country's GDP devoted to space again? Like, what would it take?
Yeah. Okay, I think we got more money in masks now than we do in space. Well, we have a half of 1%, and we had 4%, so it's 8 times larger in Apollo.
Yeah, but what would
the entire United States suddenly, within a year or so, was built. You know, I was involved with building the control center in Houston, and how fast that was. And then I looked at other things that were built at the same time. You know, there were not even all the NASA centers at the time. I think there were only 4. And suddenly, you know, and look at what happened at Marshall, from the White Sands test and from the von Braun's group to building a Saturn V. And we can't even build a Saturn V F1 engine now, because they're all hand built. And, you know, it's just amazing what we can't do,
right,
as well as what we can.
Did you ever meet von Braun? I forget what years he...
Yeah, I briefed him on Apollo 7. I actually saw him in the 50s when I was in college. He gave a briefing and I went to. But it was years later that I briefed him on Apollo 7 flight operations, and I went over to him and told him that, you know, I saw you in 1959 and you inspired me, and here I am giving you a briefing.
Yeah. So much has been written about him. What was your personal takeaway, like, from meeting him? What impression did you get?
Well, his presence in a room was staggering. He was omnipresent almost, only because of his reputation, maybe. But when he spoke with a very high, girly kind of tone. You know, if you listen to him on YouTube, you'll see what I mean. But he was so well respected that even then, that's even a half century ago, he was something to behold. But Chris Kraft, my boss, he didn't like him too much. He thought he was an arrogant ass, which he probably was. But those were, in fact, two entirely different people who were at the same levels, but opposite ends of the personality spectrum, and sort of clashed a little bit. But yeah, I got some stories to tell about those guys for sure.
Who are some of the people then and now who really pushed space programs, who maybe people aren't aware of the importance of their efforts, or has history covered them all properly?
Well, I was amazed when I wrote the Birth of NASA book. I was amazed the role that Jimmy Doolittle had in 1958, 9. Most people don't realize that he was the head of NACA at the time. They think of him still as a V-25 kind of a pilot. But he was later a big administrator, and he was the one who gave the big speech to Congress as to why NASA should be, or whatever this organization was going to be, should be a civilian one. And here he is, a military man. You'll have to read his congressional testimony sometime. It's brilliant. So he was a surprise to me. There were people who were, let's say, NASA administrators that were very quiet research types, like the Langley Research Center, which was, you know, typically an aeronautical, classical research center. But the guys who then took over for that, like Bob Gilruth, also a quiet speaking guy, became a dominant force that really moved the Manned Spacecraft Center operation, and of course Mercury, and therefore the new Manned Spacecraft Center. He was something. Now, on the other hand, you take a guy that led Ames Research Center, he was a much more outgoing pusher type. But George Lowe was my boss for Apollo for a while. Another quiet speaking guy, very powerful when it comes to administration and management. So yeah, I wrote about some of these things in The Birth of NASA, but I definitely, you know, as a young man, I was surprised then, but 50 years later when I was writing about it, I was surprised in different ways.
It's strange looking back around the Apollo, plus and minus years. It seemed that the space program was an imperative for the U.S., whereas now, as excited as people are, it seems to be more wouldn't it be cool to do this kind of thing? I don't see...
Well, people don't realize the space race impact was pretty powerful. I mean, when Sputnik was launched and people could see it in orbit, actually they weren't seeing Sputnik, they were seeing the upper stage. It was frightful that could be a nuclear weapon heading our way.
Mm-hmm.
And so the intensity of the space race and its impact on the space program was much more powerful and direct, whereas now it's, let's see, look at even Apollo 15, 16, people weren't even watching it on television. It was oh-hum in later Apollo. Now it's, I doubt if anybody on the street could name an astronaut.
Yeah.
They're just not, they were heroes then, but there's how many people are up there now? I don't know. It must be a couple.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's oh-hum.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately. Do you think will China always be, will they be a U.S. competitor in space, or do you see, how much cooperation do you see in the future?
Well, there's a law against it right now. They would definitely be a competitor. They have a manned program. They're building a space station. They've already landed on the backside of the moon. They've got rovers. They're definitely a competitor. And I don't think, especially now with the virus thing, they're more of an enemy now than they were 2 months ago. Their role in the South China Sea and all that other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're definitely going to be a long-term competitor. It'll be the modern space race, but
mm-hmm.
it won't be. They'll be communist, but they will be a different country.
Do you think China could do something that would be a Sputnik moment for the U.S.? Could you imagine them doing something that would just trigger everyone's defense response?
Even when they landed on the far side, it was ho-hum.
Right.
I don't think they can do anything. We're not attuned to that anymore. We're not surprised anymore.
Mm-hmm.
The mystical aura is gone.
Mm-hmm.
Even the Mars stuff was, we're launching again in July to put another robot there.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like it's kind of neat. And in fact, I got one of those certificates that says my name is on the spacecraft.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get one of those? They've actually, laser inscribed names of people.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, there's nothing that an atomic bomb blast, an attack would surprise us, but that's nothing in space that I can think of.
Well, I recall do you remember that sort of cigar-shaped
Oh, yeah. I can't pronounce the name of it.
Yeah, that came past, and even a Harvard researcher said that there are signs that might be, could possibly be produced by life or something about it. And that was even that, people are like, wow, for a second.
Yeah. That is so far out. People don't realize how big the universe is. They have no idea
mm-hmm.
of the limitations of the speed of light. And who was it that came up with the equation for SETI? I forgot his name.
I don't recall.
The probability of life. It's so remote that it's just, just my science background tells me that we'll never know.
Mm-hmm.
Not that they're not out there. From a theologian standpoint, I could say, well, let's see. God says, okay, well, I'm going to use the Earth here. We're going to put people on the Earth. And I think I'm going to go 2,000 light years away and put another group of humans, or whatever we call these people, over there. And I'm going to just see how those species react. I think he could play games like that.
Keep us pretty distant apart. 2000 light
Yeah. Well,
years.
you don't want to ever. Did you ever see the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still in 1951? You'll have to get that one on YouTube.
Yeah.
That's my favorite movie as far as aliens coming.
Oh, yeah?
This was the robot Gort.
Mm-hmm.
It was an 8-foot robot.
Right.
And Michael Rini was the star. That's a classic 1950s sci-fi movie. But it shows the reaction of humans to outer space people, individuals.
Yeah.
Great movie.
I have to check that one out. It's on my list.
It's worth seeing.
Yeah. Are you on the web at all? Can people find you on social media or anything?
Website was in my email to you, I think.
Okay, let me just look it up for listeners.
Yeah, it's Dutch-Von-Ehrenfried at
.com.
Gmail.
.com.
Right?
I'll spell that for people. DUTCH
dash VON dash EHRENFRIED.com.
Got it. Okay. All right.
That's my website. Yeah.
Yep. And that shows all the books and such that you've worked on and written.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you for speaking with me.
Anytime, and all the best to you.
Thank you for listening. You can find more podcasts like this on your favorite podcast feed under the title Spacewalks Money Talks. That includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. One great way to support me is to rate my podcasts, either good or bad. You can find more fascinating information at spacewalksmoneytalks.com, on YouTube under Spacewalks Money Talks, on Facebook under Spacewalks Money Talks, on Instagram under Spacewalks Money Talks, and on Twitter at SpacewalksMT. Don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter where I recommend newly published books. The subscription box is on my webpage. Thank you for listening.